So we have to go to the moon. The current reserve in the US is actually 29 kilograms. You start mapping out demand, even in quantum, it's going to be 300 to 400 kilograms. And on the moon, there's 1.1 million tons. This helium-3 isotope pours down on the moon continuously, the Sea of Tranquility and Serenity and the Ocean of Storms that make, for us, the man in the moon, for the Chinese, the Jade Rabbit. It's embedded in there. What is the benefit to humanity? What is the benefit of going to space? You've got telecommunications, you've got broadcast satellites doing mobile radio like XM, you've got direct-to-home satellite television, you've got GPS, providing GPS for Uber. Uber's a space company. Helium-3 is the beaver pelt of the economy. It's the one thing we can bring back from space that is worth it and will kick open the rest of the economy.
Who's planting the flag in the regolith?
There are two different approaches being parallel pathed right now. There's the United Nations strategy. We're not going to put weapons in space. We're not going to claim any territory for either country. The metals company just got an executive order saying, no, you know what? You're a U.S. company. Go ahead.
There's no Mounties on the moon.
There's no Mounties on the moon, but there is the Space Force, and the Chinese have their own Space Force, so it could get interesting.
Disruptors and curious minds, welcome to another episode of Thinking on Paper. My name's Jeremy. This is Mark. We're going to talk about something very tiny. We can't even see it. It's something that actually could make a tremendous difference in the world economy. It's very hard to find on Earth. There is a place where we can find it. The short hint is look up. But Mark, tee up this conversation. What are we getting into today?
We are speaking about moon mining. We're speaking about helium-3. One of the scarcest materials on Earth. It's a stable isotope used in quantum computing, cryogenics, neutron detection, and some see it as the key to fusion energy. But the problem is there's only 100 kilograms or so on Earth. But on the moon, there might be, could be, should be, is more than that. And today's guest, Glen Martin, is the CEO of the Extraterrestrial Mining Company, and he's going to shed some light on what helium-3 is, why is it important, what moon mining is, how are we going to get that from the moon to the Earth, and lots of more space industry knowledge straight from him. So welcome to the show. Thank you for thinking on paper with us.
Thank you, gents. I'm honored to be on your show.
Reading about you and your company, helium-3 keeps coming up. And I'll be honest, I'd never heard of it. So for our audience, what is helium-3? Why is it so important? And why is it necessary or worthwhile to go to the moon to get it?
Well, your intro was very accurate. It is the valuable isotope here on planet Earth. It is already being used, actually, for a lot of different applications currently. One is neutron detection, as you mentioned. It's used to scan shipping containers within the U.S. and other countries as they come across the border looking for nuclear materials, which is a code word for nuclear weapons. And so that's the majority of use today. Also, it's a hyperpolarized gas. It maintains its spin state, which is a little technical, but when you go in for an MRI for some checking for asthma or some other lung disease, you actually inhale this stuff. And it'll show up any of the diseases, and it's considered the best of these hyperpolarized gases for this purpose. Really gets interesting when we start talking about the two other major applications. One is quantum computing. As quantum computers get deployed at very large scales here in the coming 5 to 10 years, you're going to be needing a lot of it for getting the quantum computers below 10 millikelvin so they can stay entangled. It's a curious state, but at the near absolute zero, it stays entangled and so can actually function as a chip. And then to your last point, fusion is going to be the killer app for helium-3. It's interesting at the other end of the spectrum from absolute zero at 1 billion degrees, you can fuse two helium-3 atoms together and create a burst of energy and heat without creating radioactive waste, which is gold standard within the industry. You can use deuterium and tritium, but they create radioactive waste. So you start mapping this out in demand, you're looking at, to your point, maybe 100 kilograms. The current reserve in the US is actually 29 kilograms. And we only produce about 20 of it globally per year, 20 kilograms. You start mapping out demand, even in quantum, it's going to be 300 to 400 kilograms. And on the moon, there's 1.1 million tons estimated by NASA based on some samples.
Has the quantum industry started to pull any of this demand through yet, or is it kind of like a future thing that they're figuring out how to incorporate?
It's happening now. We talked to dilution refrigerator manufacturers like Maybell Quantum and Bluefors in Finland and Oxford out of the UK. And all of them are running short of supply. They're not getting the full allocations they need. They're starting to manufacture. Each dilution refrigerator needs about 40 liters, which is about 5 grams or so, and can't get the supply. They're shipping more than they can get fully charged before they ship. IBM, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Intel, D-Wave in Canada are all building out larger and larger quantum computing data centers. And they're already outstripping terrestrial supply.
Why is there so little on Earth, and why is there potentially so much on the moon?
It's a rare isotope of helium. So if you look at, what we used to put in balloons, helium, it's primarily helium-4. So it's found primordially under the ground. They find reserves of it. You may know that it's relatively rare, but not nearly as crazy rare as helium-3, which only occurs in 0.0001% of naturally occurring helium here on planet Earth. And so we only get it here because we make tritium for nuclear weapons, actually. So within the US, there's a fairly large fleet of thermonuclear weapons, which are all tritium containers. About 12 years and a quarter in, 50% of the gas turns into helium-3 because it decays. It's a decay byproduct of tritium. So the Department of Energy has to bleed off the helium-3 and they can resell it for commercial purposes, which it does. So it's rare because there's only 10 kilograms per year coming out of the US roughly. And again, early estimates of quantum demand is 200, 300, 400 kilograms per year.
It's a million tons beneath the surface. How far down?
Great question. On the surface. Okay. So the reason that it's so concentrated on the lunar regolith, the dust that covers the moon, is that it's actually a byproduct of the fusion process of the sun. So it's carried on the solar winds. The Earth blows it back out into space because we have this magnetosphere that protects us all. It keeps, the gamma radiation from the sun cooking us all like a microwave. But on the moon, there is no magnetosphere. So it just lands. This helium-3 isotope pours down on the moon continuously. And it turns out that the titanium oxide in the lunar regolith in the dark patches that we see from Earth, like the Sea of Tranquility and Serenity and the Ocean of Storms, that make, for us, the Man in the Moon, for the Chinese, the Jade Rabbit. So it's embedded in there very, 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 in relatively higher concentrations than here on Earth.
So when I think of mining, I always think of these just like giant devices that are digging deep down in. I mean, let's talk about what mining means for something that's just kind of landing on the surface. Is it more collecting?
It's a little bit like the movie Dune. If you saw the spice, and there's a case to be made that helium-3 is the spice, the melange of planet Earth for all the positive benefits it's going to have for us. But no, you go across the surface, lift up the regolith. You can vibrate it, actually. About half of the helium-3 and other volatile gases disassociate because they're only loosely connected to these titanium oxide particles. And so you can actually take the gases out with a cold plate. And then you just take the gas, all this undifferentiated gas, because there's xenon and argon and krypton and some other amazingly named noble gases in the lunar regolith as well. And then you only have to go, 3 meters deep at most. And then the beautiful thing about it, it's almost like harvesting insofar that if you take all the helium-3 out of the lunar regolith over a large patch of ground up there, in 100 years or so, it recharges completely. So it's like a sponge. It absorbs helium-3 from the sun. So it's a ever continuous, evergreen resource.
So it's not like humanity pointing towards yet another thing to just squeeze all out of and then discard, right? There's a little bit of regenerative stuff happening up there. That's pretty cool.
That's right.
If it's so abundant, you wouldn't need initially to make much of an impact on the lunar surface to collect enough to go a long way. Would that be accurate? So the actual mining material you would need initially would be quite small?
From the Earth, this will be invisible for starters. So 1 square kilometer roughly you'd need to cover to make about 33 kilograms. And so 33 kilograms, 1 nuclear reactor would burn about 50 kilograms per year. So, if we completely go green with our energy mix, supply mix, which is to say mostly fusion, Kinsey's looking at the power supply mix in 2050, they anticipate 46% will be coming from fusion reactors. That means we're going to have to deploy a lot of nuclear fusion reactors, because we're not only going to be replacing the current supply mix of fossil fuel based generation, but we're also going to be decarbonizing and electrifying transportation sector, and the industrial sectors are all going to electric and renewable sources. It's pretty clear that that fusion is going to play a major role in the supply mix, and we need a fuel. That's the strategic bottleneck, and we have to go to the moon.
So fusion, correct my ignorance, please, is we're basically trying to harness the power of the energy of a star, right? That's what we're doing? It's the same concept, right? The magic within a star, just to kind of level set where we're at.
Correct. It's, the sun is a big fusion reactor, and it's kept in balance by gravity. It's such a massive ball of fuel that the gravity contains it, and it just energy is released through the process. Ultimately, it'll burn out, as everyone knows, way off in the future, hopefully. But the point is, fusion reactor is basically a sun on planet Earth. So we just use magnetic confinement, sometimes laser confinement. There's other field reverse configurations and things that keep the plasma ball contained.
But kind of that donut thing, right? There's
that's the tokamak, it's called. That's an old Soviet architecture. So I think that was their gift to us to make sure that we never got there.
That's the one that slowed us down. Yeah,
it did. And then there's a stellarator architecture where it takes the donut and it adds a twist, so it looks like a French cruller. And the biggest,
you go, Mark.
If you're based in France, ITER just fired up. It's one of the biggest fusion reactors on the planet in France.
What's your general take on the possibility of fusion as the future for power?
Honestly, I think it's going to be the core technology for generating electricity through our humankind's expansion into space, primarily because solar is very powerful, solar and wind, but all at the end of the day, they're all derived from the power of the sun. And then the further away we get from the sun, you lose on an inverse ratio, you lose the ability to generate electricity with solar power. So if we go to Mars, let's say, you will need to generate your own electricity. We can start with fission, which is to say, heavy elements that we break apart. But fusion is neat and tidy and powerful once we get the tech worked out, which is just an engineering problem, frankly. I believe that it'll be the core power source for all of our work in the solar system, but also here on Earth. I think it's going to be our go-to, frankly. And again, McKinsey was like, man, we're looking at it. If it gets below $2,000 per watt peak installed, overnight cost, it's called, they think it'll penetrate 46-50% of our electricity supply.
Last question about power and potential. Space-based solar power is really interesting to me. We've had a lot of guests on here talking about the ability to capture that raw energy in space, convert it to microwave, beam it to Earth, land it and convert it. Have you looked into any of that stuff at all? What do you think about that?
One of the reasons I became an aerospace engineer back in, the mid 80s was that one of my seventh grade teacher actually taught a whole class on Peter Glazer's space-based solar power construct, which came out of a big report back in the 70s for NASA. And, looking at these massive, when the early, oh, baby, now you're looking. O'Neill, yes, another man of great influence on this field. So Glazer was of that period, that optimism that was coming in, man, we're going to have these space shuttles. They're going to be flying 30 times a day, basically free, free to space. And then later I became a designer on the International Space Station, and I had 2 payloads go up, and it was far from free. But the point is, they looked at, that's how I, created a passion, and I know it will work. I know that space-based solar power, and you look at SBS Alpha by John Mankins and some other more recent architectures, which there's new companies coming up that look like they're cracking a bit of the code relative to the cost of launch. It's absolutely going to play a role.
A few weeks ago, we had some whistleblowers from Microsoft, and they were speaking about the contracts that Microsoft have had with various fossil fuel companies and how they're using AI to streamline and make the process of extraction much more profitable. With the increased demand for GPU from the AI industry, does that put the brakes on any potential transition to fusion because the demand is going to be so immediate and the technology won't have caught up? Or am I looking at that the wrong way?
Well, there's an interesting interstitial step that may actually drive sort of the transition through to fusion, which is to say, because of the GPU energy demand and thermal cooling requirements, and hence potentially a lot of use of water. And one of the reasons in the southwest of the US in particular, this is such a hot topic. Tucson, Arizona is like, no, we're saying no to this particular data center because it was going to consume a lot of the groundwater. But the energy constraint is really, they're all running headlong into it. I think one of the companies is reactivating 3 Mile Island, for God's sakes. And then nuclear reactors are going to be coming online as quickly as they can build them to power these things. They got to be behind the meter because if they're on the grid, they're going to be driving up wholesale electricity costs, which is what they're doing. But there's a disruptive event that's coming, and that frankly not many people are talking about because they're just projecting GPU deployments for AI on a straight line, and it's more electricity on planet Earth that we can generate for 10 times whatever we can generate. So we're going to hit a wall, frankly, on that. And Philip Johnston, brilliant man. They're going to be deploying, I think, November 2nd down here in Florida to low Earth orbit. Potentially, this idea of putting data centers in space is one of the relief valves for this bottleneck. The other is quantum. And so as these GPU-based data centers for training large AI, large language models run into these bottlenecks, and they're running out of places to put them as well relative to data latency, they're going to start deploying quantum GPU hybrids. So a lot more quantum. Quantum is very good at certain types of calcs, and I think Willow at Google just ran a test where they were 27 septillionths faster than a GPU or some insane number. Julian Kelly over there, another great candidate for thinking on paper. So they're good at certain things, and GPUs are great at certain things. So it's likely that we're going to see a lot of quantum data center hybrids being deployed in the next 5 to 10 years. And so that's going to pull down on the power demand and the cooling requirements for water. But that then creates the strategic bottleneck of helium-3. And all this will be in advance of the fusion deployments, which if you look at Helion or Tri-Alpha Energy, and by the way, Sam Altman is one of the biggest investors in Helion, as is Breakthrough Energies, which is Bill Gates' investment arm in Seattle. So they're placing bets on fusion, but my money, and this is really not a well explored topic, is these quantum hybrid data centers.
Every quantum guest that we've ever had talks about this hybrid approach to how quantum computing is going to scale. And it's not going to be like, hey, we're throwing away classical compute. We're just kind of bridging them, or we're being smarter about what we use one and the other for. So let's talk about XMC a little bit. How do we get to be able to grab some of that wonderful dust off the moon and bring it down to Earth and help solve some problems?
Right on. Well, look, as I mentioned, my background, I was a designer on the space station starting in the early 90s down in Huntington Beach, and worked on the starboard 1 and port 1 segments, which are the thermal control, the heat rejection into deep space. One of the big constraints that Philip at the Star Cloud guys are really grappling with, how to reject heat into deep space. That's a 250 kilowatt array. The astronauts are creating heat. It's been flying for 25 years now, mercifully, without, knocking on wood, without any operational problems. But that was $150 billion investment across multiple civil space agencies, US, Russia, Canada, Japan, and the European Union. The idea that we're going to do another Apollo 2.0 or ISS 2.0 to start expanding the global economy into cislunar space to create a cislunar economy is just not going to happen. And it turns out, I took, back in 97, I launched some satellites. I started a new satellite operator company, sold the two satellites in space, then got migrated over to large-scale solar development, terrestrial, and started working with some really interesting companies and financial partners and development entities and some governments in Canada and elsewhere that really, sort of drove this idea that you can use private capital through private-public partnerships to develop massive infrastructure, billions upon billions of dollars. Interestingly, there's like a $2 to $3 billion sweet spot in financing these things. So if you package space infrastructure in a very similar way that you might package a solar plant or a liquid natural gas terminal or a brand new bridge or tunnel or airport. It actually can be developed and financed very rapidly. And so that's the thesis of XMC, is that we'll be bringing all of that, the lessons learned that I got over the last decade of developing infrastructure on Earth, solar and smart grid, and bring that to space infrastructure. And I believe that's the way we're going to crack the code, because it's not going to be government, not going to be defense. It's not going to be venture-backed startups up there building billion-dollar lunar mines. It's going to be developers that are used to developing large scale space infrastructure.
Yeah, the public-private partnership, I think, is an interesting scale approach, right? Doing it one or the other is going to take forever.
Correct. And just to touch on Mark's background, it's a methodology that was really embraced by the United Kingdom, picked up in Canada and Australia. You had to modify the way the governments buy services. They have to think, okay, I'm going to do a 10-year deal with this private entity, this private infrastructure entity, and give them a concession agreement, say, to build a highway from here to there. The U.S. is lagging somewhat in this area, which is interesting insofar that we don't do multi-year offtake contracts here, but it's starting to peak in. One of our advisors, actually, who you guys would love, is Charles Miller. He's one of the early commercial space entrepreneurs. He founded NanoRacks and more recently Link Global. And he actually conceptualized the idea of the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services contract for the NASA resupply missions to the International Space Station, which is really a P3 contract. And so who won that was SpaceX, in addition to Orbital Sciences. So SpaceX is what it is today because of this P3 architecture of supplying the space station. And then later, actually, they won the follow-on, which was the human delivery of humans to the space station.
I live in France, and things get built incredibly slowly. And then you hear of other countries in the world, they build megalopolises in the time that we build a bridge over a stream. In the international community for projects like this, are some countries moving quicker than others? Are they more ambitious? Do they have more readily accessible goals?
Yeah, well, the elephant in this room, and we could talk about the United Nations Committee for Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and they have a space resources working group that's working on a treaty for how we can actually make claims on the moon and tech the operations, and have this country say, okay, this company is going to do this, and we're going to be here, and you stay out. There's a 100-kilometer keep out zone, and under the Outer Space Treaty, in honor of this particular treaty from 1967. But to your point, the big gorilla in the room is China. If you want to talk about high-speed rail, well, I don't know the statistics, but it looks like in, 20 years, they've completely blanketed their country in high-speed rail. They can build a brand new station in 12 hours. And they're doing the same with high voltage electricity lines. They're building up massive solar and wind facilities in the northwest of the country and linking that down to the population centers. They have absolutely cracked the code. And when I was a designer on station, in 1992, I was called into a conference room over a weekend, Thanksgiving weekend, actually, to redesign the elements that we were building, to bring in Russians, to bring in the Russian components, to do station keeping and resupply. Because after the fall of Soviet Union and then the Duma, when Yeltsin came in, we decided that we didn't want the Russians to do, build nuclear weapons for bad actors. So we wanted to embrace them and bring them into the space station, which we did successfully. And to this day, even with the war and everything else going on in Ukraine, the Russians are still flying to the space station. We still have Russian cosmonauts on the station, but we blocked the Chinese. Somewhere along the way, we decided that we didn't want the Chinese in on our top secret space technology. So we blocked them, a little bit like we did with NVIDIA chips. And so they worked around that, and they've created an absolute relentless machine that has been, okay, they built Tiangong, their space station, in 3 years. It's been continuously operating the last 4 or 5 years. I can't remember exactly how long it's been flying. They have a plan to land taikonauts, which is what they call their astronauts, on the moon by 2029 because that's the 80th anniversary of the revolution. And from 1949, all analyses are showing they're just chunking away at that goal. They landed on the moon in 2020 and 2024, in the fields with the highest concentrations of helium-3 and brought back 2 kilogram samples. So they're doing it. They know what's up there, and they're going for the helium-3.
The politics of space. Who's planting the flag in the regolith? How do we solve that problem before we get up there? How do we come to some kind of global agreement?
Well, the answer is we do and we don't. There are two different approaches being parallel pathed right now. There's the United Nations strategy, which when Russia and the US were going to go land a human on the moon, and there was big, the first space race, and it looked like it was going to be before the decade was out, according to the Kennedy speech. And so the United Nations got together very quickly and said, okay, you know what? We're going to draft and everybody's going to sign this outer space treaty where we're not going to put weapons in space. We're not going to claim any territory for either country. We're going to treat space very differently. And both the US and Russia and all the other countries, which weren't at the time spacefaring, signed the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, 2 years ahead of the 69 landings. Right now, the United Nations is doing exactly the same thing. They're coming up with a space resources treaty for a draft is being released in 2027, 2 years in advance of the 29-30 landings that everyone anticipates. So it'll have all the language about how we peacefully cohabitate and share. And then there's the rim of eternal light, I'm sure you guys have heard, on the South Pole, which has 24-hour solar, and where the water is concentrated in the permanently shadowed regions of these craters like Shackleton crater.
We had a great little chat back and forth. I think it was one of our book club lives where someone chimed in on what does a permit look like for the dark side of the moon. I thought that was pretty fun and clever. But
well, funny, that's where the Chinese landed, which, they put together a relay satellite network to be able to land on the far side of the moon with a nuclear-powered rover, take the sample and go back to Earth. Then there's when I mentioned the parallel path, the other path is what's being done in deep seabed mining. There's an analog right now happening in that the United Nations has the Deep Seabed Mining Authority in Kingston, Jamaica, a little bit like the ITU in Geneva, where they control geostationary frequency regulation, everything else, and coordination between countries. So this Deep Seabed Mining Authority in Jamaica, it's plugging away, but it hasn't come up with a framework yet. And so, a U.S. company, the metals company, just got an executive order saying, no, you know what? You're a U.S. company. Go ahead. And that's the way we're going to do it. And so when it comes to the moon, it may look a little bit more like the gold rush in the Wild West, honestly, than Western Canada, which had RCMP officers showing up to instill order in the law beforehand. So we're going to see which methodology takes precedence. But honestly, if you just go up there and start mining under U.S. domestic space laws, we have to rely on the Space Force as the cavalry.
There's no Mounties on the moon.
And there's no Mounties on the moon, but there is the Space Force. And the Chinese have their own Space Force, so it could get interesting.
Tech is an accelerator to anything. But we have some very biologically ingrained human challenges that work in counter to that. If we could rewrite rules on how humans operate, what would be some optimization that we could consider and think about?
This is one of the big questions I get when we talk about how we're going to do this mission architecture. How do we fly to the moon? How do we mine it? Or, sift it, I guess would be maybe more accurate. And then how do we bring it back? And the short answer in the time frame we're talking about is autonomous robotics, AI-driven, little brains on the lunar surface, a little bit like Tesla robo-taxis, but out there without any humans in the loop, meaning we're not teleoperating them. They're thinking for themselves. They're avoiding obstacles. They're not going to tumble down the side of a crater. They're intelligent agents. And they're the humans, we're talking about landing on the South Pole because there's water, and we need water, and we need radiation protection, and we need shielding from the micrometeorites and from the thermal swings of the moon, which is still very bloody cold. And so when you talk about enhancing humanity, this is a fun, interesting thing. I know Elon Musk fairly well. I almost bought the first Falcon 9 for that satellite company I was telling you about. If you squint and you actually look at the body of his work, you can see where he's going with creating a hybrid human species that will be able to survive the rigors of space travel and landing and settling, that loaded phrase, the moon, Mars, and other celestial bodies because of Neuralink and these things that we're going to need to adapt the human biology for space because we are really poorly adapted for it.
You mentioned rovers, intelligent rovers deployed on the moon. They're grabbing the stuff, they're sifting it up, putting it back on some sort of conveyance device to get back to Earth. And so what do you have a goal in mind on when like the first little rover is deployed? What do your timelines look like?
NASA's been doing a great job with this CLPS program, which is Commercial Lunar Payload Services. And so they've been sprinkling some development dollars throughout this really dynamic ecosystem that's emerged in the sort of shadow of SpaceX. So, $10 billion went into the SpaceX alumni startups. So you got guys spinning out of there constantly and gals. And they're starting little companies, a lot of them in Hawthorne, El Segundo area, doing things like Starpath is doing propellant manufacturing on the moon and little rovers and things like that. You got Lunar Outpost, you've got Intuitive Machines, you've got Astrobotic, you've got Firefly and others that are developing rovers and landers and robotics and other critical enabling technologies getting funded by NASA. And so, you got 2, 3, 4 commercial landers every year now landing on the moon, testing these technologies. The tech is developing very, very rapidly. It's just looking for a customer. That's the thing, right? So lunar mining is actually the customer that all these companies need to go beyond just NASA research grants and maybe defense contracts.
So on that set, a few weeks ago, we broke down Philip Metzger's paper. It's quite an old paper now about bootstrapping the space manufacturing industry. We got quite a lot of kickback from that by people claiming that, okay, you can't go to the moon and use 3D printers to self-replicate humanoids because the resources aren't on the moon. How confident are you in that 1.1 million tons of helium-3 and resources on the moon's regolith in general?
We're blessed in the US. We have about 400 kilograms of lunar regolith in Houston at the Johnson Space Center that was collected by the 6 missions that landed and samples. And they did it using a scoop in a bag and some other things that, probably let loose a lot of the helium-3 molecules by agitation. So we've got really great data on what the regolith is composed of. They did, core samples. Jack Schmitt, who I've met over the years, Apollo 17 astronaut Harrison Jack Schmitt, he was a geologist. He was the planetary geologist that was training all these test pilots and fighter jocks to collect rocks. But on the last mission, they said, you know what, we're going to cancel the program at 18, so we better fly a geologist. So Jack went to the moon in 17. He landed in the Littrow Highlands up just on the edge of Sea of Serenity and found the orange glass, which proved, these lava ejections into space of magma, volcanic activity. But the samples from 11, 17, and 12 actually showed the highest concentrations of helium-3. And so you can actually extrapolate. And then there was further analyses done. The Clementine mission in 1994 that BMDO did, the U.S. Air Force, under then Brigadier General Pete Worden. They scanned the moon and found these titanium oxide locations where it's more highly concentrated. So there's a lot of data that supports the estimate, again, 1.1 million. And a lot of people think it might actually be underestimated because of that collection methodology I just referred to. And then the Russians had 3 Luna landers that also correlated this data. And now the Chinese have brought back 2 samples. And so that's being analyzed now. And they actually found a new crystal structure they've named Chang'e site for the Chang'e lander, which is the Chinese legend of the maiden that flies to the moon. But it embeds helium-3 within it. So they're finding new forms of this stuff. So not confirmed. There's something in mining called prospecting, which is you look at it from space or from low-flying aircraft, and then there's exploration. You need to get boots on the ground, take a core sample, say, and capture it accurately, and really say, okay, this much is in this regolith over this patch of land.
One question I always like to ask is what questions did you want us to ask that we didn't yet?
You touched on both the 2 questions that I really didn't want to cover. I mean, the second being, what is the benefit to humanity? What is the benefit of going to space? And if I can answer my own question in this way, obviously helium-3 is something, and I've looked far and wide, by the way, guys. I was looking at lunar ice mining at one point and platinum group metals on asteroids and solar power from space, something I worked at Phantom Works in the early 90s in Huntington Beach. We looked at this. And all these will come to be. This Anton Brevdy has this great thesis, which is there's this space for Earth economy right now. It's about $500 billion. And it's primarily made up of exporting data from space. You've got telecommunications, you've got broadcast satellites doing mobile radio like XM, you've got direct-to-home satellite television, you've got GPS, providing GPS for Uber. Uber's a space company at the end of the day because you couldn't do it without space assets. And then there's other elements, Earth observing satellites, which are really becoming a very powerful thing with low launch costs. And so that's all Earth economy focused, right? That's serving the Earth economy. And this idea that at some point we're going to transition to this $2 trillion space economy, it's got to transition to something that's providing services to other space entities commercially. So that could just spin wildly, once you kind of prime the pump. And, I grew up in Canada, northern Canada, at a location, Sault Ste. Marie, where the Hudson's Bay Company used to trade beaver pelt. And the King of England, King Charles II, saying the Hudson's Bay Company of explorers and adventurers are allowed to go to the New World and create a corporate entity on the New World to bring back beaver pelt, this one thing that was valuable back in Europe that the New World had. And so it actually kicked open the rest of the North American economy, along with some other things But the point is, Helium-3 is the beaver pelt of the economy. It's the one thing we can bring back from space that is worth it and will kick open the rest of the economy. We'll have mining operations on the moon, robots. We'll be buying services from solar power guys, from telecom, from navigation startups. So I think that the analog holds really well here. This is the Hudson's Bay Company. The Extraterrestrial Mining Company will be the one thing that kicks this cislunar economy open.
The catalyst for B2B in space. That's I like that.
Unfortunately, one of my quick fire questions was, what are you curious about at the moment? But Glen's curious about everything. So what's the one most, what are you more curious about than anything else this week?
This week, I've been extraordinarily curious about how debt is structured for social infrastructure. And I've been talking to a lot of my Japanese colleagues at Nomura Securities. How do they fund bridges and tunnels and LNG terminals? And how do you approach that? What's the development process look like? And, so I've been doing this insane deep dive on large-scale infrastructure project development. There's a great author, Bent Flivbjerg, I'm sure I just mangled his name, a Dane, who wrote a book with Dan Gardner from Canada called How Big Things Get Done. It's inspirational. It really speaks to what we're doing, and we're doing a big thing.
What are you scared of this week?
I'm scared that we're losing momentum. If we're in a great power competition with China, we need all to be firing on all cylinders. We need science to be working with industry. We need the manned space program at NASA to be moving ahead. It's under Artemis Accord, which is this brilliant international architecture. Got, now with this beautiful, amazing, Starship Flight 11 happening, we now have the platform to actually deploy rapidly to cislunar space. And so we just need to get our act together relative to how NASA is coordinating and get Jared Isaacman in. Full stop. That's my endorsement for today. So it scares me that we're not.
Didn't NASA just cut a bunch or lose some funding and cut a bunch of people?
JPL lost 500 folks.
500, yeah.
Yeah. And these are not dead wood, man. It's cut into the quick. We were founded in Pasadena. There's a lot of real talented folks down there with Caltech. And so, I've seen this before, in sort of waves of consolidation. Honestly, I think they'll all find homes. I think they'll spawn some startups. I think there'll be great resources for, new hires for these well-funded, this ecosystem that's emerging. It'll just take a little time to adjust and
just a re-architecture more than anything else. Yeah.
Pretty much. Yeah. That's it.
Okay. Who are you listening to at the moment?
It's Ian M. Banks. I'm a huge fan of the cult
Mark.
theory, and that's who I listen. I'm just re-listening to all 8 books.
Which is your favorite culture novel?
Accession, without a doubt. Accession.
Why?
It's focused upon the AI and their search for meaning and how they interact. And that to me is one of the most fascinating questions to be answered now with the emergence of AI and potentially AGI soon.
You mentioned a word that is a chorus in my head on a daily basis, the word curiosity. The thing that scares me is the world is becoming less curious individual by individual. Tom Waits has a great quote that says, we're in a deficit of wonder. What could you say to the world right now to help them activate their curiosity, their sense of wonder?
Well, maybe I'll just quote or paraphrase Tom Waits on this point, which is to say his muse comes to him at the most inconvenient moments. I would simply say, he's driving his car in traffic in Los Angeles and he's like, not now. And so I would say, listen to your muse, take the time. It's coming to us. Ideas are out there. They're occurring to everyone all the time at the same moment. It's nothing really unique, and I can't really defend an idea. It's just execution, man. So listen to your muse. Listen to what Tom Waits has to say. Make sure that you got a pen and pencil ready to write it down.
I love it. Honor the moments. That's wonderful.
Listen to more Tom Waits. Our final question, Glenn, is from Kevin Kelly. We ask it to every guest on Thinking on Paper. What should humans be? And if you need it, how does technology help us get there?
Humans should be good. We should be good. We need simply to be good to each other. How does technology get us there? Space resources alleviate shortage. They alleviate need. And I think using the power of AI, and this is why I'm a huge fan of Ian Banks and the Culture series, that shows what is possible when we have AI in our lives that's benevolent, allowing us to be ourselves. And so he writes about what is called post-scarcity societies. And so the reason I'm pursuing space resources, I'm driving towards a post-scarcity society. So we humans can simply be ourselves and be good to each other.
There you have it.
Thank you.
Glenn,
Wonderful.
Thanks for joining us. This has been great. There you have it. Helium-3, the why, the how, the where. Stay tuned. It's going to be a pretty dynamic story to watch. Mark, closing thoughts?
Be disruptive. Stay curious.
Keep thinking on paper.
Wow. That was an emotional episode of Thinking on Paper. If you're still with us, and of course you are after that, if you have any questions about that show, email us at hello@thinkingonpaper.xyz. Subscribe on the platform you're listening. And please, as a curious mind, share this with just one person in your life who would like to hear these conversations.
Maybe two. Share it with two.
Maybe two. Share it with two.